Before I read today's text from 1 John, it's important to recognize that all Scripture is written in a context. You know, years from now, when we watch old reruns of TV shows, we'll see people wearing masks on them and think, oh yeah, that was shot during the pandemic of 2020. It will make sense to us. And when today's school children are grandparents, they will show pictures to their grandchildren and tell them stories of lockdowns and going to school online, somehow still in the snow having to walk uphill both ways. But, you know, grandparents' lore is always like that. But, you know, eventually stories will fade, those stories particular, and things so easily understood in 2021 won't be in 2221. And all of that's to say that we are so far removed from the time of the Johannine community in 1 John, we don't know exactly what the big deal was. No one was sitting there writing history books at the time like today. It made sense to those who lived it, but to us? So before I read the text, I want to share what one scholar said about it. Anyone hoping to track by means of linear reasoning through these few verses in 1 John is likely to emerge seriously frustrated. The author seems to be going around in circles and then questions whether this is, quote, a vortex of sentimental religious jargon sucking its audience down in a rhetorical swirl. You ready to hear it? So listen for the word of God. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God, and everyone who loves the parent loves the child. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and obey God's commandments. For the love of God is this, that we obey God's commandments, whose commandments are not burdensome, for whatever is born of God conquers the world. And this is the victory that conquers the world, our faith. Who is it that conquers the world but the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? So perhaps I should just leave it there and affirm that, yes, this is a vortex of sentimental religious jargon sucking its audience down a rhetorical swirl. And we could approach these texts, as well as the whole Bible, literally, or we could take them seriously. Because, you know, literally, it sounds as though those who do not believe Jesus is the Christ are not born of God. To take the Bible seriously, however, as we do, means we have to question the context. What's going on, for example, in the rest of the book? And we know, as we've been talking about 1 John for a couple of weeks, it's about a divided community that needed encouragement to love one another. We also need to know what else is going on in the rest of the world. And a major issue in the late first century was whether Jesus was real or just seemed real. Now, the big word for that is docetism, which comes from the Greek word that means appears or seems. As Marcus Borg said, when this is applied to Jesus, it means as though he seemed and appeared to be human, but he was not really human, he was divine. But 1 John refutes this tendency among some in the Johannine community by countering with the final verse from today's reading. So following the words, Jesus is the Son of God, verse 6 continues, this is the one who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ, not with water only, but with water and the blood. And the Spirit is the one that testifies, for the Spirit is the truth. The word of the Lord, thanks be to God. Really? But yes, because essentially the author argues Jesus was real. Water and blood, not water only, which likely refers in some ways to his baptism and crucifixion, but it might also refer to what later theologians described as an idea that Jesus was both human and divine. Not just an apparition or an idea, not merely an object of our collective consciousness, but the real thing. For example, Jesus was physically on the street among the people, not simply preaching liberation for the captive, but participating in the liberation of the captive alongside the captive, just like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and James Baldwin, who didn't just speak about ideas about liberation, but put their own real flesh and blood bodies on the line for it. But on this Mother's Day, I wonder, who were the women before the men? I mean, who first taught them to do this? So I read a fascinating book earlier this year called The Three Mothers: How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped a Nation by Anna Malika Tubbs. It's the first and only book of its kind, but part of an emerging genre of literature that attempts to fill in the male-dominated stories of the civil rights movement. Now, can you name these three mothers? It's Alberta Williams King, Louise Little, and Berdis, B-E-R-D-I-S, Baldwin. I want to tell some stories from the book about them. Each one helped their sons make ideas about liberation real with their own bodies. Mama King filled her children's minds with endless possibilities, especially at the family dinner table, where she and Reverend King spoke truthfully with their children about the injustices of segregation and taught them the importance of doing their part to change such inequities. Now, Martin's big sister, Christine, said, people seem to think he came fully formed from the womb, ready to change the world. But, she said, we are products of a long line of activists and ministers. We come from a family of incredible men and women who served as leaders in their time and place. But it was also personal. When Martin was a young boy, he would play with the white children of a family who ran the corner store. They were inseparable for years, but as they grew older, his friends' parents started to create distance between the children. And when they were of a certain age, it was no longer acceptable for them to be friends and eventually prohibited. Martin was terribly hurt. Mama King felt her son's agony and encouraged him to feel his pain and turn it into something positive. And she did the same thing when she met her husband, Michael, her husband who later adopted the name Martin Luther after a trip to Germany. Alberta was a college graduate, but when they met, Michael, Daddy King, he was barely literate. And he spoke with such a terrible stutter and accent, he could barely be understood. She tutored him, helped him get through college and achieve all that he became. The figure of Daddy King was bigger than life, but not without her. And also, did you know that Ebenezer Baptist Church was her father's church? And her father didn't think that highly of Michael? Yet he became that famous pastor after her father's death. Alberta lived an exceptional life focused on family and church and community service, but it was tragically cut short. And I'm not sure everyone knows that she was shot to death by a deranged man in church while playing the organ during a service, 6 years after her son. Now, in comparison with the other two mothers, Alberta lived a quite privileged life, was afforded many opportunities for herself, and was able to provide many opportunities to her children. Louise Little, on the other hand, was committed to a mental institution for nearly 30 years, consigned there by a system of white supremacy that tried to destroy her. So, Louise was born on the island of Grenada. She later moved to Canada and discovered the principles of Marcus Garvey. As a young woman, she became a fiery grassroots activist for him, promoting Black economic independence, self-help, and unity among people of African descent all around the world. She met her husband, Earl, through those activities, and they dedicated themselves to the Universal Negro Improvement Association. They moved frequently while serving the cause, but also often forced to move. Because Louise was so outspoken, she was often a target. One day while they were living in Omaha, Earl was out of town when a mob of angry white men showed up at their house. They came with shotguns and rifles, yelled threats, and shattered their windows. Louise stood fearless, calm in the midst of the chaos, and placed her hand on the pregnant belly that held Malcolm, while she comforted her other children. When her children came home from school, Louise would reteach them what they learned from the white teachers. She refused to let her children fall victim to a mentality that told them they were inferior to anybody else. Among other things, she taught them the French alphabet, made them read Black newspapers every day out loud, and kept a dictionary nearby. She wanted to expose her children to various religions, so they attended Catholic Mass, congregated with Baptists, and learned from Hindus. And then they went home to discuss their thoughts. When Earl died, she attempted to hold the family together. But with 11 children, she needed help from social services. Now, a Black single mother in a predominantly white area of Michigan, she was increasingly visited by welfare workers who seemed more interested in taking her children and the land she owned than with helping her. They started planting seeds in the children's minds that she was crazy and told Malcolm how much more he would like it if he lived with a stable family. Louise saw a psychologist who said there was nothing wrong with her that rest and better nutrition could not cure. He told this to a welfare doctor who got the psychologist to recant his statement in order to place her in the Kalamazoo Mental Hospital, where they kept her drugged up from 1939 to 1963 and allowed to see her children but a few times a year. Despite the trauma, after her children worked and worked and worked to get her released, she came out strong and reconnected with her family. But without Louise Little, there would have been no Malcolm X. And not simply because of her role as his mother, but because she provided the critical thinking of his Black Pan-Africanist worldview. Now, much less is known about Bertus Baldwin. When she gave birth to James, Jimmy, in New York City alone, she had absolutely no family support or extended circle. They moved from apartment to apartment together, trying to survive. Jimmy, as a child, would pick up odd jobs like shining shoes and running errands. One day, when he was 10 years old, Bertus sent him out to find firewood. He was walking down the street when suddenly he felt hands on him. 2 white police officers pushed him into a vacant lot and searched him because he, quote, looked like a suspect. When they couldn't find what they wanted, they left this 10-year-old just lying on the ground. And because of that and other experiences, James once wrote that he had no childhood. As a poor Black boy in America, he had already been born dead. Bertus tried, but she could not shield her son from this kind of racism, nor their poverty, nor from her husband, whom she called Mr. Baldwin. Jimmy's stepfather was a preacher and terrifyingly abusive. As the oldest, Jimmy had to help raise the 8 younger children of the man who beat him and his mother. James did get one particular gift from his mother, and that's an amazing intellect, a love for words, and the ability to write. His biographer once said he would take care of one of his siblings with one hand and read a book with the other. Bertus had all those gifts but was not able to pursue them for herself. But she did everything she could to nurture them in James. And when he decided he needed to escape America and could move to Paris on a writing fellowship, despite her needing his help to care for her children, she supported his decision and sent him on his way. And that's where he used the critical distance to come to an understanding of American racism. When he came home, he soon met with Martin Luther King Jr., who had just emerged as a leader following the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, there are so many more wonderful stories that I would love to share with you. I don't have more time, so I encourage you to read this very accessible, very interesting book for yourself. However, to return to our text from 1 John, my final word of encouragement is to not just read such books, but to use such books, to move from the ideas on the page to a life lived in service of those ideas. You know, the kind of life the very human Jesus taught all of us to live. To put the water and blood of our faith alongside with our bodies, put it on the line for love. Now, I wanted to share with you some video clips of these three mothers, and as much as I searched for them, I was only able to find something about Alberta Williams King, and I do want to share that with you. So let's watch this about one of the three mothers, and then we'll sing together.